My whole street died from cancer, including my mom.
Sandra Edwards is walking down her street in Houston's 5th Ward, and she is counting houses. Not because she is nosy, but because she is trying to remember who used to live where. Miss Lucille over there, Sophie Lee Mitchell 2 doors down, Mr. Dunn on the corner. She loses count after a while and simply says, "It's like the whole street passed away from cancer." Now, here is what Sandra did not know for most of her life. Underneath her feet, underneath her house, underneath her neighbors' houses, there is a plume. A toxic underground plume of chemicals that has been spreading through the soil and groundwater for decades, and nobody told her it was there until she was already an adult watching her community get sick one house at a time. The source of that plume sits just down the road. A rail yard that used to treat wooden railroad ties with a substance called creosote. The Environmental Protection Agency classifies creosote as a probable human carcinogen, meaning if you are exposed long enough, your chances of developing cancer increase. The facility operated from somewhere around 1899 all the way until 1984. That is 85 years of chemical treatment happening right next to a residential neighborhood. But here is where it gets worse. According to a report by chemical engineer Jim Tarr, the railroad did not just use creosote. They mixed it with what Tarr called extenders, industrial waste products purchased from facilities that are now EPA Superfund sites themselves. Tarr said that the creosote extender was absolutely without a doubt dangerous, and that the toxicity of those compounds was the real problem, not the creosote itself. The railroad dumped this mixture into unlined pits. No containment, no barriers. Just open holes in the ground where toxic chemicals could sink straight into the earth. And sink they did. Over time, that contamination formed an underground plume that spread outward and downward until it ended up directly beneath more than 110 homes in the Kashmir Gardens and 5th Ward neighborhoods. In 2019, the Texas Department of State Health Services confirmed what residents had been saying for years. There was a cancer cluster in the area. Rates of lung cancer, esophageal cancer, larynx cancer, and liver cancer were all significantly higher than expected. Then, in January 2021, a second report found elevated rates of childhood leukemia. In one census tract near the rail yard, the rate was 5 times higher than what you would normally expect to see. Now, let me be clear about something, because this matters. The state confirmed that there was a cancer cluster. The state did not confirm that the creosote caused it. The official language says no known cause. That is how these things work in science and in law. You can have contamination in one place and disease in another, and unless you can draw a direct line between them with absolute certainty, you cannot say one caused the other. But residents and city officials believe the connection is real. When you look at the chemicals involved, when you look at where they are, when you look at who got sick and where they lived, it is hard to imagine any other explanation. Union Pacific Railroad, which now owns the site after merging with Southern Pacific in 1997, has maintained a very different position. Their official statement says decades of testing show no exposure pathway from Union Pacific's site to any resident. They have consistently denied responsibility for the health issues in the community. They have refused to pay for relocations. And for years, they proposed monitored natural attenuation as their cleanup strategy. That is a technical term that basically means doing nothing and waiting for the contamination to break down on its own. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality rejected that approach as inadequate. In 2023, the EPA finally stepped in and started a Superfund investigation. That is 40 years after the facility stopped operating. 40 years of that plume spreading. 40 years of people living on top of it without knowing what was underneath them. And this is not the only place where this happened. Up in Elkhart, Indiana, there is a rail yard that operated from 1887 to 2001. It was one of the largest classification yards in the country, with 72 tracks spread across 675 acres. For decades, workers there used a chemical called trichloroethylene, known as TCE, to clean engine parts and machinery. TCE is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a known human carcinogen. It causes kidney cancer, liver cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Residents started complaining about the rail yard as early as 1961. Between 1961 and 1968, there were numerous citizen complaints filed with local and state authorities about discharges into the St. Joseph River. Nothing happened. Then, in 1986, a resident reported that his private well contained elevated levels of TCE. The EPA finally investigated and found concentrations of trichloroethylene at nearly 1,000 times the safe limit. The maximum contaminant level set by the EPA for TCE in drinking water is 5 parts per billion. They found it at 4,870. Court documents obtained by attorneys show that many railroads had a practice of simply dumping or hosing down excess solvents directly onto the ground. At some locations, these chemicals were stored in rusty drums and leaky tanks, and then buried on railroad property. The EPA eventually declared the Elkhart Rail Yard a Superfund site in 2002. It is still considered one of the worst hazardous waste sites they have identified. Out in California, there is another story that just wrapped up last year. The Dunsmuir Rail Yard sits right next to the Upper Sacramento River. Since the early 1900s, the facility had a massive steel tank that held Bunker C fuel for steam locomotives. Later, it was replaced with a diesel tank. And for more than a century, unknown quantities of fuel seeped into the soil, the groundwater, and the river itself. A citizen reported oil along the riverbank in 2018. But according to the EPA and state agencies, the seepage problem had been going on for over 100 years. It took until 2021 for a formal cleanup operation to begin. By the time it was finished in late 2025, crews had removed approximately 75,000 gallons of oil and 100,000 tons of contaminated soil. They also restored 1,400 feet of damaged shoreline along the Sacramento River. 3 different places, 3 different decades, 3 different sets of chemicals, but the pattern is the same every single time. The railroad operates for years, sometimes for generations, dumping or leaking toxic substances into the environment. Residents complain. Nothing happens. People get sick. Still nothing. And by the time anyone in authority actually steps in and does something about it, the damage has been spreading underground for longer than most of us have been alive. Back in Houston's 5th Ward, the city approved a $5 million fund in 2023 to help residents relocate. But here is the thing that still haunts people like Sandra Edwards. New residents are still moving into the neighborhood. Developers are still building. And according to recent reporting, many of the people moving in have no idea they are settling into a federally recognized cancer cluster, sitting on top of a toxic plume that has been there since before their grandparents were born. Union Pacific still says there is no exposure pathway. The EPA is still investigating, the lawsuits are still ongoing, and the people who have lived there their whole lives are still waiting for someone to do something more than just test the soil and write another report. That is where it stands right now.